Welcome to another program in our series, Freethinking Forum. I'm Bill Weir, producer of it, and I'm delighted to have as my guest today Representative Peggy Flanagan. Thank you, Peggy, for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And you had a public town hall meeting with your constituents on April 9. I had the pleasure of attending, and where we spoke of many concerns. Mm-hmm. Are there certain of those concerns that stand out for you that I know you're working as lead on the economic stability for families, child care assistance. Mm-hmm. Is that something that?
It certainly is. I appreciated all the folks who came out to the town hall forum. You never know on a Sunday afternoon who's gonna show up, but I think we had a really good showing, and it just demonstrates to me that people are engaged and concerned about what's happening, or frankly, what's not happening over at the Capitol. The concerns that I heard from folks, ranged from making sure that we had a bonding bill, a transportation bill, a tax bill, finishing up the work that we didn't get done last session. And folks had some concerns about some of the legislation that's been introduced regarding private prisons, the lack of support for the environment and our natural resources, and the protest bill was certainly something that produced a lot of conversation on the 9th as well.
Yes, and do you want to go into more detail on the bonding bill?
Well, I wish I could go into more detail on the bonding bill. We haven't seen it yet. No, we haven't seen it yet. So I believe that we were told.
Who's bottling it up?
Well, I think that's a question for Speaker Doubt. He said it's in a drawer and they've got it. We'd like to see it because last year, the end of session, we saw the bonding bill, I believe, 4 days before the end of session.
That's not enough time.
It's not enough time. There's a lot of work that goes into the bonding bill, and we think, that it's important for folks both in the legislature, but also the people that we represent to have an opportunity to vet the bill, to see it, to know what's in it. And these are projects, because we didn't pass one last year, that communities are waiting for across the state. And so I think, in fairness to our communities and to these projects that folks are waiting on, we should see it as soon as possible.
And sometimes that money, if it doesn't appear this year, they can't do the project at all.
That's right. And so because it wasn't, we didn't have one last year, those projects have been stalled. And if we, folks are waiting. And I think it's a little unfair. So we need to see it as soon as possible.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I think I'll call Speaker Doubt.
Yeah, I think you should. Absolutely.
And on the transportation bill, mm-hmm. Is there Southwest LRT?
So there's been consistently from House Republicans and folks, also the Republican Senate, attacks on the Southwest LRT, which I think is ridiculous. They don't want to move this forward, and there's been millions of dollars that have been invested in this project so far, and we're leaving. And
millions more that would be lost.
Absolutely, and millions more that would be lost. And when we look at Southwest LRT, it's a program and a project that cities along the route are enthusiastic about. The Chamber of Commerce is supporting this project, and believe it'll help get people to jobs, and it's a great investment both for the region but for the state as a whole.
Well, why isn't the leadership listening to the Chamber of Commerce?
Well, that's a great question. They listen to them on a lot of other issues, and this should be one of those as well. And when we look at sort of the bang for the buck as far as investments in public projects, Southwest LRT, when we look at the light rail, is one of the best investments that you can make. So I am perplexed by the lack of support for this. We can have a robust transportation system that supports public transit, that ensures that we have light rail access to buses, metro mobility, and also invest in roads and bridges. So I don't think it has to be an either-or conversation. But unfortunately, the bill that was introduced by Republicans has a 40% cut in access to public transportation.
Wow.
And when I think of folks like my husband, who rides the bus every day into work into downtown Minneapolis, 40% of the people who work in downtown Minneapolis use public transportation. So 40% cut, I think is, will be detrimental to families like mine, but also to people who are dependent on public transit.
Yes.
So, I was unable to vote in support of that bill because I think it was short-sighted and really hurts folks, especially in the Twin Cities, that we should be making sure of access to transportation to get to work and to daycare and to school. And it's not the right policy for Minnesota.
I agree. How do we get them moving on a more reasonable transportation bill?
Well, this past week has been our spring break, and folks have been out and across the state of Minnesota talking to people about the need to, to invest in our transportation system. And I am also confident in Governor Dayton and his ability to negotiate and make sure that, we've seen the first round of omnibus bills, and, we're waiting to see what happens now. A lot of these things will be negotiated with the governor, negotiated with the Senate, negotiated with the House, and so hopefully we'll have some bills that better reflect the values of Minnesota. And I think investing again in public transportation is in line with those values.
And now, there are a number of other bills that came up in the town hall meeting you conducted, and I think one of them was distracted driving. Is there some action on that?
So I think that there was a bill included in the transportation bill on distracted driving and hands-free cell phone use. I know that the state troopers have been cracking down on distracted driving, and I think that that's important.
Yes, for the safety of everybody.
Absolutely, and hands-free cell phone usage is something that I certainly support, and think that can be bipartisan legislation.
Yeah. Now, is there any question about maintaining women's reproductive rights?
Well, all I've seen recently is attacks on women's reproductive rights. I serve on the Health and Human Services Policy Committee, so we had 2 bills come through there that will attempted to limit access for women for reproductive health. The first is a bill that's similar to Representative Wendy Davis. If you remember, she stood on the floor in the Texas legislature to filibuster a bill that puts sort of ridiculous requirements on clinics who perform
extra wide doors.
That's right.
And all that sort of thing.
And sort of under the auspice that this is to protect women's health, when really
That
we know
doesn't
it's just
protect
that's
them.
right. Women need access to reproductive health care, and so
Yeah.
that bill was introduced, and then another bill that prevents women who receive medical assistance from accessing abortions and reproductive health care. And so I asked both of the bill author and the testifiers, who have they talked to? Which women have they talked to who are on medical assistance who are asking for this change and preventing access to? And they said, well, this has been something we've been lobbying on for a long time. And I said, okay, again, I come back to the women who will be directly affected by this legislation. What have they said? Have you had conversations with them? And the answer was no. So again, I think, it's in Minnesota, and certainly the folks that I represent in the western suburbs have made it clear that they value access to, a full range of reproductive health care, and abortion needs to be part of that care.
Yes. Now, there were attempts, I think, to clamp down on protests. And it sounded like they wanted to punish groups, not just the individual who was doing bad behavior.
Right. So, Representative Zerwas, who's up in Elk River, introduced this legislation, which essentially makes it extra illegal for folks to protest. Right now, it is currently illegal for folks to protest or to protest on a highway, at an airport, to block public transportation. And essentially what his bill does is increases penalties so that if you are arrested protesting on a highway, at the airport, blocking public transportation, you'd receive up to a year in jail. And, you know, I think what has been very clear is that, you know, this bill was introduced after the protests around Philando Castile, Black Lives Matter, and, you know, for many folks has been seen as an effort to silence the voices of individuals of color. And I think a better approach would be to listen to those folks who are protesting in the first place and to see, you know, why are you protesting? What are the sort of root causes of that protest? And those should be the issues that we should tackle, not
before they have to resort.
That's right, not
to
exactly
blocking interstate highway.
And if people are you know, are protesting, are using those tactics, they want to be heard, and they feel like they're not being heard in any other way. And so it is an inconvenience, but I think, you know, for me and for many of my colleagues, you know, we saw folks like Bull Connor in Alabama, right, who said, you know, we need to increase these penalties, and you know, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, with Martin Luther King, and
I was there.
That's, well, there you go. And so you know that people were crying out for justice, and it is similar. It's similar today. And you know, one of the things that has been most heartening to me is that I've received calls. I'm a Democrat, I'm a DFLer, but I've received calls from conservative Republicans that I represent who've said, you know, Representative Flanagan, I don't agree with you on much, but I do agree with you on your stance on this protest bill, and believe that it infringes on our First Amendment rights. And so I think, you know, I hope that the governor will veto this measure, and that we can really listen to people who are protesting in the first place and get to those root causes and concerns.
Yes, far better.
Yes.
To listen to. Now, is there anything on the copper, nickel, gold mining?
So I know you know, the bill overall, the environment bill leaves a lot to be desired, and I think, you know, has given folks sort of free rein to corporations and polluters, and I think that we need a better policy.
Yes. Well, hopefully the governor will hold that
I
up.
hope so. You know, in along the same lines, Representative Garofalo introduced an amendment that we heard on the Jobs and Energy bill that would allow Enbridge to come through and build a pipeline without going through any of the environmental studies or any sort of public input or feedback.
So no concern about ruining the environment.
That's well, and you know, I think what folks think, and you know, I certainly believe that there will continue to be pipelines while we're driving cars and using oil, but to just go directly through
without any hearings.
Without any hearings, without hearing from the public, it's wrong. And you know, as a Native American, you know, and a member of the White Earth Nation, I have a lot of concerns about the pipelines going through wild rice beds and going through treaty lands. And we had quite a turnout when that bill was heard on the floor from concerned citizens from across the state of Minnesota. And you know, the governor has said that he will not give a free pass to Enbridge, and I appreciate that. So it matters when people show up.
Yeah. Now, cities, some Minnesota cities have tried to increase the minimum wage, and where is that now? I hear there's an attempt to preempt the city's right to increase not only minimum wage, but other features of wage relationship.
That's great. So That's correct. There has been Republican members of the House and Senate have introduced these preemption bills, or what we call corporate interference, which
that's more like it.
More appropriate, yeah. And so essentially what this does is, this would prevent cities or municipalities from increasing their minimum wage, from passing any type of laws around earned sick and safe time, family leave.
Wow.
And I think it's, it's been disappointing. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle oftentimes talk about, the need for more local control. But they seem to only want local control when they control the locals. And so, I think this is bad policy. And there's been folks in Minneapolis and St. Paul who spent a lot of time organizing communities, working with city council members, with employers, to get to this place. And I'd be disappointed to see this pass. Another place where this has shown up in preemption is to prevent cities and municipalities from banning plastic bags and styrofoam. So I don't know. As a state representative, I want to depend on mayors and city council members to do what they believe is best for their communities, and I can focus as a state representative on state business instead of getting involved at the local level. There, we should trust local governments to do what they need to do for their communities.
Yes. And on the other hand, a few years ago, there was a passage of a bill that freed cities and counties to have their auditing done by someone other than the state auditor. Mm-hmm. Is that working out?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation. I sit on the state government finance board, and so our committee, and so there's been a lot of conversation about the state auditor, and I think we need to continue to have this conversation. It's being fought in the courts right now, but I think the state auditor has done a good job, and we should support her in her work. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, and I hear, is there anything more on ranked choice voting that we can hope for?
Well, I don't know that we can hope for anything on ranked choice voting in this legislative session, but it's certainly something that I support. I think it leads to more robust debates, more civil debates, and allows people to sort of not have to hold their nose when they're voting for someone, but can really consider all of the candidates.
Yeah.
And
when we're allowed to make a second choice, I think there have been elections in the recent past that would have come out differently.
That's right.
Had the voters had a chance to rank choice the candidates for governor.
And we're having that very conversation right now in the city of St. Louis Park, the city where I live, one of the cities I represent, about moving to ranked choice voting, and I think it's a good idea.
Good. Mm-hmm. Now, in the schools, I've heard there's a shortage of public school counselors. Is there anything that your legislature can do about it?
Well, I think there is. I think we need, to give additional funding for schools for school counselors. We have one of the highest student to counselor ratio. And we think about highest, that's not a good thing. That means there's fewer students who have access. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And when we see students facing increasing mental health issues, and that comes into the classroom and sort of affects the ability for students to make progress academically, this is something that we should really all think about and invest in. And it's not just an urban problem or a suburban problem or an ex-urban problem or greater Minnesota problem. This is something that we've seen consistently across the state, and it needs to be addressed.
But we do now have the bullying law, mm-hmm. Anti-bullying.
That's right, and we need to protect that provision and make sure that that's not rolled back. Absolutely.
Good. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I've been concerned about is reopening of private prisons. is there a move to reopen them?
There is a move to reopen. Representative Tim Miller, who represents the community of Appleton, Minnesota, has introduced legislation once again this year to reopen the private prison there with CCA, a corporation CCA, which has a terrible track record for outcomes for those who are incarcerated. And listen, I think we can look at other solutions instead of incarcerating additional folks, and it's not a great use of state dollars. We should not be using our money to open private prisons. We should be using our corrections dollars to invest in programs that cut down on recidivism rates and help those who are formerly incarcerated.
Now, I've heard a proposal recently that the state simply lease the prison empty and put in state employees that we know would treat them properly.
I mean,
Has that come up yet?
Well, you know, the commissioner of corrections is not asking to open this prison, and I think that we should be listening to him and and ensure that again we are investing in the infrastructure that we already have and make sure that it's
I thought there was that the corrections commissioner had asked for that, but I'm wrong.
I don't believe that's the case.
Yeah. And it's the representative from that locale probably concerned with getting more jobs.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So now, were there legacy bill changes that we should pay attention to?
Well, the legacy bill, I think, was okay. It just didn't go far enough. And so again, as we're looking sort of over the next several weeks here, we need to wrap up sine die. The last day of session is May 22nd. So as we're looking, my hope is that there's some attention there to put more in that bill. But there are other bills that I have much more, I'm concerned about it, but there's other bills that I think the public safety bill, the transportation bill, the jobs and energy bill, and in particular the health and human services bill, which cuts $600 million to some of the most vulnerable folks in our state, right? So when we look at health and human services, these are our programs and investments in children, in low-income families, in seniors, and in people with disabilities.
Wow.
And I think it's terrible when we have a $1.65 billion surplus that we're not using those dollars to invest. And so, as you mentioned earlier, I'm the DFL lead on the subcommittee on affordable and accessible childcare. We spent over a year traveling across the state together, listening to families talk about the need for more childcare, infant care in particular, listening to providers, childcare providers who need additional support, and heard a lot about the need to invest in the child care assistance program. We currently have, and in Hennepin County, we've got over 5,000 families on the waiting list.
Waiting list for what?
Waiting list for the child care assistance program. So these are families who are working families, and right now are trying to sort of cobble together child care here and there, and they need access to reliable, safe child care for their children.
Yes.
And again, this is something that we heard and unfortunately didn't see additional support for this particular program in the way that we needed to.
Maybe those parents are too busy to take time to write their
legislators. Right, but at the same time, these folks came out. They turned out.
Oh, they did.
They did, absolutely, to these meetings that we held across the state. And so I'm really
good.
And we should be in conformity with the feds, and that was not included in the HHS bill as it relates to child care, and it's a huge missed opportunity. So I'm disappointed.
Now we've got 3.5 minutes left. I know you are strong on thanking some key people for what their work. One, the Education Commissioner, Brenda Casillas. Was that on stopping the bathroom bill that plagued North Carolina?
Well, this bill has been introduced. It hasn't moved. It hasn't gone anywhere. And my hope is that it doesn't go anywhere. When we think about what we need to do, we need to make sure that we're protecting all of our students and make sure that our schools are safe and supportive environments. And so, these bathroom bills that are sort of ridiculous, that, ask students to use a bathroom that correlates with their gender that was on their birth certificate. Who's going to check that, right? Who's going to enforce that? Let's just make sure that, listen, I have a bathroom that men and women use, in my own house. This is ridiculous. We shouldn't be targeting our students who are trans. We should be making sure that we're supporting them and welcoming them in. So Brenda Casilius, the commissioner, has done a good job of making sure that our kids feel supported, and I appreciate that.
I'm sure our listeners have more opinions to pass along to you. We've seen the phone numbers and the address for you, Representative. And if they call your office, you have a legislative aide, Acolade?
Acolade is my legislative assistant, and he's wonderful. And so, if you want to meet, you want to visit, something important to let me know about, he can make sure that you get connected.
And he grew up in Egan, I understand.
Apple Valley.
Oh,
yep,
Apple
Valley, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, yep, he's great.
So he knows Minnesota.
That's right. He knows Minnesota, exactly.
And you have a town hall meeting with Congressman Keith Ellison and County Commissioner Linda Higgins.
Yep, and Representative Mike Freiberg. So that's coming up this Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we're going to be at Golden Valley City Hall. So sort of a Civics 101. You can learn more about how a bill becomes a law. How does the county commission, the federal government, the state, how do we all work together? So
Good.
I think it'll be a great opportunity, and hope folks can come by.
Well, thank you for working together.
Hey, thanks, Phil. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll have you back again as you get some of these problems straightened out.
I'm going to try. Thank you.